Welcome to the year 2029. My name is Linda and I'm one of the co-directors of Leaders for Global Sustainability, an initiative that's been running for almost 10 years now at the University of Melbourne. Today though, I'm going to be your host as we reflect on some of the interesting things that have happened over the last 9 years, some of the things that have allowed for Australia to go from a country that was relatively reticent and reluctant to act on climate change to one that is now, we could maybe consider, a pioneer on climate action and the reducing of emissions. We're recording today's panel on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I want to pay my respect to elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation and extend that same respect to any Indigenous Australians who happen to be watching today. 2020 was that year that started with raging bushfires, that catastrophic experience that really brought home just what climate change impacts would look like for most Australians, regardless of where you live. Many of us barely had the time to mentally or emotionally or even physically recover from that before we experienced COVID-19, something that was, yes, a global phenomenon, but for those of us in Victoria, especially Melbourne, meant months upon months of lockdown. Whilst COVID-19 wasn't something that any of us were asking for, it's definitely something we'll never forget. One of the reasons why I won't be forgetting 2020 and that whole period is that it became a real turning point in our shared history. COVID-19 really became that catalyst for how we started to confront a whole bunch of different issues, particularly the climate crisis. Today, I'm joined by three esteemed movers and shakers who will share some of their reflections on how COVID-19 was a catalyst for a different way of living, a different way of thinking, and a different way of doing in paving that pathway towards a more sustainable Australia. So I'd really like to introduce our three guests with us here today. So we've got Associate Professor Michael Sean Fletcher, Dr. Lyndon Ashcroft and Eitan Lenko. So Lyndon is an expert in science in many different shapes and forms, so both climate science, which makes her a great panellist for us here today, science communication, and she works at the University of Melbourne. But instead of just focusing on academic papers, she works a lot with citizen journalists and citizen scientists as well. And if you recognise her voice today, it's probably because you've heard her on local community radio. Then we have Michael, who is a descendant of the Wurundjeri people. He is an academic as well at the University of Melbourne, where he holds the role of Associate Dean of Indigenous for the Faculty of Science there. His research as a geographer really spans a lot of interesting things. So there's humans, so us, climate, landscape, vegetation, disturbance, and really how they all interact together. So he's got some good insights and reflections coming up for you all. And lastly, we have Eitan, who is the wearer of many different hats. Some of those hats that you might be familiar with include his role as a technology entrepreneur, an infrastructure investor, and, you know, if you've caught on the theme today, an alum of the University of Melbourne as well. That's the thread that connects us all. One of the things from 2020 that I still really remember about your work, Eitan, was your role as chair of Beyond Zero Emissions in launching the 1 Million Jobs Plan and actually being able to see how much of that has really come into fruition, which is very exciting, and I'm sure you'll share more on that in a bit. Now it's 2029, but I just want to again take us back to 2020 where our climate targets were really woeful. They were pretty embarrassing. They weren't very ambitious. They didn't really align with what the science was saying we needed. And Lyndon, I want to ask my first question of you. Given that our targets were so low, I think we knew that we were locking ourselves into a little bit of climate impacts in various shapes and form. And you specialise, I know, in 19th century weather patterns. Can you tell us a bit about, now that we've been able to drastically reduce our emissions, what your colleagues who are looking at 21st century weather patterns, like what are they seeing? How much has actually changed and shifted because of the large-scale economic policies that we've brought in?
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Climate and the climate system, our Earth, it's a pretty slow-moving beast, you know. We've made great inroads in reducing our emissions, and we are seeing that carbon dioxide curve sort of flatten off in the last few years, but we are already locked into a lot of things, into a lot of climate change, as we know. So it's been 90 years since Guy Callender, the UK geographer, I think he was, first said, oh, hey, I think the Earth might be warming a little bit. The IPCC, of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, celebrated 40 years last year in 2028. So they've been around for a long time trying to pull together the best piece of climate science and the best climate information we have to make valuable decisions. And the research that is being done now is sort of building on this science. It's been known for a long time. We're putting more carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere than have been there for a really, 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 really long time. With all those extra molecules, they can capture extra heat, extra energy, and that energy is manifested as heat and as changing in our weather patterns. So the weather systems that we're looking at now in the 21st century are pretty much bang on what has been predicted and projected for at least 30 to 40 years. So we're seeing a southerly shift in our rain-bearing patterns in the southern parts of Australia. That's been happening in southwestern WA since at least the 1970s, and it's lucky that the governments there have been on top of that and have, you know, made transition plans, and they're working with that. But those weather systems that bring us in southern Australia the regular rainfall in the winter, we know that they're just not happening as regularly anymore. While as in the northern part of Australia, we're getting wetter, wet seasons. Sometimes it takes the monsoon a while to arrive, but when it does, it's really there and it doesn't mess around, and that is also having ramifications for the environment there. So they're the weather systems that we're seeing. And climate scientists more and more, we were doing this at the start of the 21st century, but more and more now we're working with communities, with local governments, talking with people, asking what sort of questions do you need answered? Okay, well that's sort of a question that's hard for our type of science to answer, but why don't we try to answer this kind of question, you know? What types of rain are we going to get? We're getting more thunderstorms, we're getting more intense rainfall, and that again is something that was predicted by the science, by the physics, and is now bearing out. We're getting those big, more thunderstorms, we're getting more really heavy rainfall events that have impacts on infrastructure development, on how we sort of plan our water management, those kinds of things. And of course, we're studying extreme heat. You know, we've seen it doesn't matter whether it's an El Nino year or a La Nina year, we're still breaking records year on year. Australia's still knocking it out of the park in that respect, which is, we've still got a way to go there. But we're also looking at extreme heat waves, okay? We're looking at heat waves throughout the year, but of course, everyone remembers that melting summer of 2024-25, which in terms of deaths of humans really blew the 2019-2020 black summer bushfires right out of the water, because those heat waves of course are the most devastating natural disaster that we have, and they just went for so long and they started so early, and even though we have good warning systems in place, they were brutal. And so instead of us backing away, though this is the big change, instead of us backing away and saying what we're doing is not working, we forged on ahead. And so now climate scientists have the exciting opportunity to see, all right, well, we've been studying graphs that go like this for so long. What about a graph that goes like this? Or maybe a graph that goes like this. And so that's really exciting for us. We've got the best computers we've ever had. We've got more people engaged than ever before. We've got more communities engaged than ever before, more businesses, more industries. So climate scientists are very, very busy.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great reminder that when I look around the world today, I'm like, oh, it's so great that we have all of these emission reducing sort of schemes and mechanisms in place, and not forgetting that it did take a fair amount of effort to get there, and it still took some pain and loss, and that transition that we've sort of seen over the last decade is still coming, and it's still an ongoing process, and yeah, it's not all just sort of happy days. Yeah. As a keen observer of history, Eitan, one of the things that I think caught me by surprise, and the science sort of does move slowly, and it can be easy to think of any large system as moving really slowly, but I was surprised by how quickly some of the economic changes happened. Can you share a bit more about, with your expertise, did it catch you by surprise that we finally saw action because of economic momentum?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you've said, I've got a science background, but when I think back to 2020 and that COVID time, I don't believe in fate, but it was just incredible, the confluence of events that all came together at the one time and almost in perfect order as well. So, we had in 2018-19 that ramp up of activism. So we had the school strikes and people really getting worried and expressing their worry, Extinction Rebellion, people going out in the street and doing big things. And then we had the bushfires, and that really brought home to middle Australia and to the average person how serious climate change is. Like, who can forget, when our cities were covered in smoke and it was hard just to breathe. And then we went straight from that into COVID, and this sense that we can deal with the crisis, like we can listen to science, we can do all this crazy stuff, we can suspend flights, we can shut a whole country down, we can do whatever we want, and this sense that that we can act on crises if we follow science. And then, we had the economic crisis that followed COVID and that need for government stimulus to get our economies back on track. And like you say, kind of while that was all happening at the same time, we had this incredible reduction in the cost of generating renewable energy and in the cost of a whole lot of electrical technologies like electric vehicles, like heat pumps, all these things that kind of were just right there ready just at the right time, so that when we needed to put massive stimulus into getting our economies back on track, those technologies were there and really at a really investable state just at the point where they were much cheaper than their fossil fuel equivalents, to make it really clear for investors that was the only way that we could develop our economy, by pushing forward on those things. And we started to see that the dominoes fall. So we had, right at the end of COVID, we had this rush of countries announcing net zero emissions targets. So we had China, we had Japan, we had South Korea, we had Biden winning the election in America and making it pretty clear in 2020 that they were going to go hard on climate. And we saw the Australian government really starting to wobble kind of around that time, kind of ended 2020. There was language changes and kind of hints that they were going to look at their approach. And it was really when America went super hard in 2021 and showed they weren't going to muck around. And we had that incredible momentum in the lead up to the COP meeting, the International Climate Meeting in Glasgow at the end of 2021. And that was when we saw Australia really kind of take on that almost, that thing we'd been waiting for, almost like a race to the top amongst our political parties to show who can make the most of this economic opportunity. And that was the way it was really framed in Australia, as an economic opportunity. And that the outcome of that was that we were able to go to that meeting with really strong targets, and Australia really changed from being a country that was trying to hold things back to protect its vested interests, being the world's biggest coal exporter and one of the world's biggest gas exporters, to understanding that world was gone. And obviously the bankruptcy and the financial troubles of those industries, it really helped with that. And then really fully seizing as a country the incredible opportunities we have with the world's biggest renewable resource, and our ability to do things like generate hydrogen, to electrify our industry and be really competitive on the world stage in energy intensive industry, and even begin to that was where we really started seriously considering our export opportunities for renewables as well. So yeah, to me it was like this perfect storm of events in a good way for a change that really bumped Australia onto the right path.
Yeah, and I think it's only in retrospect that we can consider each of those what at the time could have felt really disparate events to actually have been the perfect path to this future that we have today, and all of the things that are possible there. And it's interesting, over that last 9 years, we've seen some new projects pop up. We've seen some projects that were already around in 2020 really get expanded upon. And I know one that you're really interested in, Michael, is the Aboriginal Carbon Fund. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and, the growth that that's had over the last 9 years, both in terms of the environmental outcomes, but also the self-determination aspect of it for Indigenous people as well?
Yeah, it's a great point. So the notion of being able to mitigate carbon release from changing the timing of burning in landscapes came out of the Garneau report, which was, I think, in 2000 or a long time ago. Seems like deep past
many
now.
decades.
Yeah. And that really spurred an initiative in the top end of the country, in the Savannah country, called the Carbon Farming Initiative, where Indigenous communities were encouraged to go back on country. Typically disadvantaged and disaffected Indigenous communities were encouraged to go back on country and burn throughout the year, in recognition that late season catastrophic wildfires in the north were contributing massive amounts of carbon in the atmosphere. And by getting fire in throughout a year, you can reduce those catastrophic fires and reduce the overall carbon output. And then slowly this was recognised that the catastrophic fires at Southeast Australia, this really dense, flammable forested system, were releasing into the atmosphere through the decades, through the 2000s, and especially culminating in the 2019-2020 bushfires, were huge, really significant contributions of carbon into the atmosphere. And the recognition that by returning cultural burning, Aboriginal burning, which burns throughout the year, reducing landscape fuel loads, decreases the risk of these catastrophic fires and these massive carbon releases. And the Aboriginal Carbon Fund sought to provide an economic incentive and basis to get mob back on country. And despite the really weak efforts by the federal government, the Australian government, following the Royal Commission in Natural Disaster Arrangements following the 2019-2020 fires, a lot of grassroots organisations and efforts began. And there's a slow recognition that actually by getting Aboriginal people back on country, burning throughout a year, you not only reduce the amount of catastrophic bushfires and amount of carbon released in the atmosphere, you start to arrest some of the big environmental problems that were accompanied by climate change, such as biodiversity loss and other things. So the Aboriginal Carbon Fund, through various instruments that have ensued after then, such as a return to emissions trading and other sorts of things that can economically support these initiatives, has really started to wrestle control, if you like, back, especially in the southeast forested estates, of the landscape back from these catastrophic fires into what was really the dominant kind of management over tens of thousands of years prior of cultural burning, which is having not only impacts on carbon, but I think most importantly to Aboriginal people, is it's returning them to country, it's making them healthier, and it's making the country healthier, and sort of helping mitigate against some of the other effects that climate change has had and is still continuing to have, but changing the amount of catastrophic fires. Even despite the 2024 melting summer, we didn't see the kind of fires that we saw in 2019, 2020, because people started to manage country and keep fuel loads low. We did have the fastest rate of biodiversity loss on Earth, and that's been wrestled back in control, in large part due to appropriate management back on country. So that kind of catalyst, all those events, the long, slow burn, if you like, of the carbon farming initiative and its success in the north, what Aitar mentioned about the protests, the climate protests, the catastrophic bushfires, and then this realisation with COVID that maybe the way we're doing things isn't the only way. Maybe there's a diverse way of doing things, be it working from home, be it different kinds of energy, be it all these sorts of things. People started to open up and listen to other ways. And we really started to see cultural burning, or the Aboriginal Carbon Fund, which supports the cultural burning initiatives, starting to have a real significant impact on all of these metrics.
Do you think as well there's also been an increase of trust? We had that melting summer, and some people might say if we're halfway through this transition, we had a really bad summer, therefore this isn't working, let's just give it all up and, prop up the fossil fuel industry a bit longer. But I think in this decade it was nice to see that increased trust, not only in the science, but in communities and in people who know their land. Like, do you think, I feel like that has also really made a big difference over the last 10 years?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I don't know whether that's a COVID thing or that was a post-Trump thing, you know, like the world realising that maybe the media that was occurring and the critique of the media and the fake news era, if you like, that slowly media became trusted again, and they weren't just going for the sensational headlines, weren't demonising certain parts of the community, so that when it came to trust them in time, for example, Aboriginal communities, when it came to trust them with this very, very important thing of managing country, that trust could be built rather than a constant sort of erosion of that trust through a media really sort of parasitising off bad news stories. So I think that a whole series of events propelled by the real cataclysmic changes or events that we saw at that period have fostered that, I think, yeah.
Correct. And I think that process of Australians, after the bushfires and all the other natural disasters, you know, that happened in the early 2020s, that kind of understanding that the way that, you know, white people have been managing land in Australia didn't work, and increasing understanding that Aboriginal culture had better answers, that also was what I think really started to bring Aboriginal culture back into the heart of Australia and that Australian education system. And we saw that blossoming of pride in our, you know, incredibly long history and culture that's been in this country. And I think that's why we're in such a better place with Aboriginal relations now than we were just 9 years ago. Like, it's been a real transformation in the attitude of the entire country.
Totally. And for me, one of the biggest learnings there is just what time really means. We're here talking about 9 years, but when people have been on a particular land and country for tens of thousands of years, what does that really mean in terms of perspective? And I think we were so used to that flip-flopping in Australia where, you know, we had an emissions trading scheme, we didn't, we now have one again, and like we still have one, like we just didn't keep reverting back to things the moment an election result came through. Like, we started to think about things with a little bit more of a longer term perspective. That said, I think one of the reasons why our emissions trading scheme, you know, was eventually implemented again and like still exists today, and, you know, it's becoming more strict and sort of like ambitious as we move into the future, is because of the decline of fossil fuels as like an industry and the power of their lobby. And I'd be really interested, again, Eitan, from you, like how much of that was an economic thing? Where did that power get redistributed to? Like, it definitely changed our media landscape, but where else have we seen changes there?
Yeah, well, it's hard to even remember, like, you know, we clearly remember, but, you know, it's hard to imagine that time back in 2020 and earlier.
When we were beholden.
Yeah, the fossil fuel lobby had, you know, they could take down prime ministers, they could do whatever they want. This, like, you know, pathetic small industry that's around today, you know, could never dream of doing something like that. But, you know, 2020 was really when we saw that started the rise of the clean tech, climate tech industry. You know, the climate tech bubble of 2022 really kind of started back in 2020, particularly after the American elections, when Biden was talking about his big climate plan. We saw a big run up in the valuations of climate companies like Tesla and like SolarEdge and those sorts of companies. And as those companies got bigger and richer, they really started to get more sophisticated in their lobbying techniques as well. And so they were kind of going head to head in their ability to influence government and influence the media. And, you know, it was pretty clear that they were on the ascendancy and the fossil fuel industry was on the descendancy. So I think it was when to me, the real turning point was in 2020, was it 2021 or 2022, when the Minerals Council in Australia really kind of realised that coal was on its way out pretty seriously, but they also had this huge opportunity in mining in Australia with all the new minerals, you know, the copper and all that sort of stuff that we needed for renewable technologies, and they became fully throated advocates for the transition and to go faster, because they realised that was in the best interests of their members that were actually going to survive, you know, and there was time to cut off the membership that was dealing with obsolete technology. So, you know, in some ways there was a bit of a kind of just a swap over. We saw the power of the fossil fuel industry kind of being transferred to the clean tech industry. But I think there was it was a messy time. So there were great opportunities for like community-owned facilities to spring up solar farms and wind farms and battery installations. Obviously in Australia we had that huge democratisation of energy with solar panels being put on, what is it now, like 90% of buildings around the country, and we're at the point with every single building in Australia being electrified around by around 2027, that now everyone in Australia lives in a house where they don't pay any energy bills. Our buildings are completely self-sufficient. We charge our cars at home or in a charging station that's powered by renewables. So we don't feel that. We used to feel guilt when we moved around, and I think that was one of the things that's really hard to remember back 10 years ago, was that feeling of guilt that we had, that we just couldn't live our lives without damaging the environment. And now we're so far along that path of being able to do stuff and knowing that we can do things in a way that don't stuff up the planet at the same time. And it's just such a I just remember that load I used to have that's gone now.
Yeah, and I think for me, like, COVID and having to sit at home and like really slow down really made me think about, wow, what does this mean in terms of lifestyle and mind shift and perspective shifts in terms of what's possible? How can you still travel and not have that like heavy load? And obviously some of that technology is really caught up. What are some of, I guess, the mindset shifts that you've had, either you've seen in your communities or that you've personally experienced over this last decade, that you think has been really important?
I think one of the biggest mindset shifts that I've seen in the last 9 years is to do with the connection of the individual action to the global situation. And that, again, I think it stems from COVID, but it's kind of in both directions, not just realising that what you do, and I mean, we all remember like the great quashing of the second wave down in Melbourne in 2020, which is still like legend, and Sir Dan Andrews, he's still remembered very fondly in Victoria, but this realisation that what I do as an individual can actually make a difference to these numbers that I see every day, or to what's happening in my larger area, that was, I think, really empowering for a lot of people. Yes, it was very difficult, but it was very empowering. But also the other direction, realising that something that's happening in the globe, something that's happening on the other side of the world, actually can relate back to me. And I think that opening or that greater appetite and interest, I mean, the greater appetite and interest for science is one thing, but the greater interest in global situations, in global issues, while at the same time more pride and more heart opening, I suppose, for local communities, really brought people back together after 2020, I think, and it really connected the world again, but not in as much of an earth-eating kind of way, that guilt that you say that I remember as well. My first child was born in 2020, and the confusing emotions of guilt and fear and grief about that, it's really nice not to have to pass those on to her. But I think those connecting those different directions has been a really big change.
I think also there was that global connection, but we still have regular picnics in our local parks, like there was a local connection as well. And I think that's kind of bolstered or enhanced the role that Indigenous Australians have had in teaching Australians how to connect to country. But we've also, during the lockdown, you couldn't go more than 5 kilometres from your home, and people were still wanting to get out and about. And I felt that people really connected with their place, and then once the restrictions lifted, people started travelling around again, but that connection to place still lingered. And then sort of allowing and letting Aboriginal people show the way to operate in this country and how to connect with country has had a really positive influence on our psyche and the way that our responsibility and our involvement in country, rather than just sort of, that's nature, leave it alone, it'll do itself. No, we're embedded and we belong. And I think that was one of the major things that come out of COVID, that global realisation, but also that local connection, I think is really important.
Totally. Technology is like still such a big part of our lives, but when we had that 5 kilometre experience, especially for all of us in Melbourne, and we started to rely on those mutual aid groups that eventually just became your neighbours and your people that you would also hang out with and not just ask you.
We rediscovered community.
Yeah, and like what that meant in the context of like where you live as well. Like it's still great that, I can call someone up who lives halfway around the world, and we were able to do that 10, 20, many years ago. The telephone's, not a new invention. But suddenly thinking it's it matters where I live. It matters who my neighbours are. It matters what this land has meant for many thousands of years for others as well. And it's important that I know that. And again, it's that idea that hiking was no longer the only way we saw nature anymore. We didn't like drive these great distances to do these epic hikes. We could appreciate what was in our community. And I thought that was probably for me, my favourite mindset shift actually, Michael, is reconnecting with people, community, in the place where I live and not having to travel great distances to do that anymore. Did you have any mindset shifts other than, the many you've already mentioned that have stood out for you?
To me, the big mind shift of the COVID period, particularly if we're talking about climate and technology and stuff, was that I think that was when we went from the mindset that we have to act on climate because it's a disaster and civilization will end if we don't, and we kind of have to do it, to it being seen as this incredible opportunity. I think when business really started getting involved and the corporates and the economics, like you say, came into line, everyone was like, wow, Australia's we're really sitting on a gold mine. We've got the world's best renewable resource. This is what the whole world has committed to decarbonising in a really short period of time. Australia, just as we were a kind of a linchpin in doling out fossil fuels to the world, we realised that we can be a linchpin in this new clean economy. And I think that once that went mainstream, I think it was around 2021 when the Prime Minister gave that great speech around the opportunity for Australia, and you really saw the media come into line, and you saw that really bedding into the Australian consciousness, and all that incredible innovation that came out of that, all those ideas that we wouldn't even imagined in 2020. To me, that was the mindset shift when Australia got on board with this incredible opportunity and moved from just a position of kind of helplessness and fear and dependency on doing bad stuff, almost like we would kind of drug dealers and dependent on that for the money, to being we can...
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and just that pride that we're kind of leading the world.
It's nice to be proud, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's really nice to be proud.
Yeah, there were many years of, I think, feeling slightly ashamed, not just on how we were doing on the climate front, but on so many other issues as well. And I think there's still, some way for us to go with the relationship we have with Indigenous Australians. But we've all touched upon, those little moments that have happened over the last decade where it's so much more... Integrated's definitely the wrong word here. I'm thinking back to when we used to have reconciliation action plans. It feels like, we're definitely not at that stage anymore. But Michael, can you share with us a little bit about, I guess, what you've seen as being really significant in how, for those of us that aren't Indigenous, we've just been better at listening and learning? What sort of led to that? Was it an education piece? Was it a policy thing?
Well, I think the realisation, really the fires, the 2019-2020 fires were the main catalyst. Mm-hmm. The realisation that we were managing, the way that country was being managed was just completely wrong. Then we're staring down the barrel of, continued catastrophic fires that inflict significant ecological damage, significant financial damage, but also significant trauma on all Australians, a really deep trauma. So that sort of catalysed this kind of exploration and then engagement and then serious commitment to getting Aboriginal people back on country and the right people managing country. And I think one of the important things that's come out of that for broader Australia and Aboriginal people is, without even trying per se to specifically target things like closing the gap, returning people to country has started to see those closing the gap metrics decrease or improve. People are healthier, people are more physically and mentally better off, engaging better with school. Some of the problems that you might, or issues that you might associate with Aboriginal communities are decreasing, like substance abuse and all these sorts of things, purely because people are being empowered. They're being recognised and their knowledge is being respected, and that kind of trust is happening, and that's really buoyed many Indigenous communities. There's still a long way to go. There's a lot of Australia that is being poorly managed, and there's a lot of issues across the country. But I think that there's this kind of irrepressible wave, if you like, of uprising, for want of a better word, of Indigenous rights, and people recognising that the way forward is by learning from the people who are custodians for such a long time of this place. And it's really been buoyed by media, it's been buoyed by this shift away from kind of big ticket solutions, like coal or nuclear, or the diversification, like you say, solar panels in everyone's roofs. That the solution isn't just one thing. It's a combination of a whole bunch of different approaches that gets us forward into the new kind of world. So I think there's a lot more improvement to go. But the last kind of 9 years, 10 years has really seen a quantum shift in the improvement of Aboriginal people's lives and livelihoods, and also the health of the country.
Yeah, I think it's also helped just with general Australians' mental health. I think when Aboriginal culture and knowledge was placed at the centre of our education system in 2026, that was almost like a healing, like we knew that new generations in Australia were going to come, grow up with better understanding, with better knowledge, with more empathy, and it's just it did heal a wound, I think, in the Australian psyche that people weren't even aware that they were carrying around.
Not actively, and I think that's part of that decolonisation process that we're still going through, that it suddenly became this word that, a niche group of people maybe knew about 10 years ago, to something that we're now actively engaging with and having those difficult conversations. And I think for me it's been really positive to see that as we learn how to be better on the country here, we've extended that out to people that need to seek, refugee or asylum seeker-like status. That's no longer detention centres are a thing of the past now. That's not how we process people. We treat them as actual human beings and, treat them with dignity. So I think, that's been really, really positive. And I don't know how much of this was that COVID slowdown, but suddenly we're able to hold much more complexity in our minds. And just as you were saying, it wasn't any one solution that we gravitated towards. It was a number of different things, and we were okay with recognising that for different parts of the community or different landscapes, we needed different solutions. It's not this one homogenous place. And some of this, I think, goes back to science and some of the work, Lyndon, that you've been doing for a really long time in breaking down that academic ivory tower and engaging with citizen science. Do you think that COVID helped people get science more, and that's why we suddenly started to act on these reports that, have been coming out for many, many decades? I
definitely think people became more comfortable talking about science. We remember during the COVID times, we saw on the news every day, some false starts about a vaccine, or some, research that was talked about one day and then was checked the next day, and people saying, well, that's not peer-reviewed, or that hasn't been done sort of to a way that can be trusted, I guess.
And logarithmic graphs.
And logarithmic graphs, yes. Some more, accurate than others. Some of those scales are a little bit funny. But I think, so that made people more comfortable to hear it. And I think it also made people more comfortable to discuss it. Not just to discuss Western science, because this is the other thing that's happened, right? People have realised more and more that the way you think about the world in a Western science way, that's just one way to think about it. There are lots of different scientific approaches, or lots of different paradigms. There's a nicer word to use, I'm sure. Lots of different lenses through which to see how the world works, right? But I think people became a lot more comfortable discussing it with each other, right? Not just, I'm the scientist and this is what's happening.
You're the expert and you have the one answer.
You just be quiet because I'm speaking now and I'm a scientist and that's how you're going to learn. This,
That's how I went to school.
That's how lots of people went to school, right? And that's that idea of the deficit model. I'll just shove more knowledge into you and then you'll figure it out. Yes, that still persists in some places, but now more and more there are people who work in different scientific fields who are more comfortable talking about that things. The fact that scientists during COVID times were so well respected gave scientists across the board more confidence to talk in their communities, to talk with not only each other, but with their communities. And it made people be comfortable talking about it in the barbecue. Oh, hey, I've tried doing this sustainable thing. Oh, I tried that, it didn't work. Oh, I read this paper. Oh, did you really see who wrote that paper? That was someone else who's, funded by something that's a little bit suspect. Or I think it allowed people to be more confident to talk about it and more comfortable, like you say, sitting with the nuances, sitting with the realisation that science isn't...
It's black and white.
Exactly. It's not black and white. It's not stationary. And it does change and it does move over time. So I think that's been, yes, it's difficult to hold, and sometimes you would think, oh, geez, I'd like to go back to a time where there was just right and wrong. But living in the grey is a lot more fulfilling, as we all know.
It was great to see the difference, if you like, of the political leaders to scientists through COVID.
Yes.
Because previous, say, in the climate change debate, there was no difference to scientists. It was politicians sort of espousing that they knew everything. So that really marked a significant shift. The same with bushfires. There was a deference to people with knowledge holders, not necessarily just scientists, but traditional owners and people like that. So there was a willingness for the political set, if you like, to defer to people with knowledge and not have the pretense of knowing everything. So it was a really major shift in the way we were governed, I think.
Yeah, you're right. Experts came back into fashion in 2021.
Yeah, and
also experts realised they weren't
The only
and there was different types of
That's
knowledge,
true.
like you say.
Yeah, the wide meaning of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing how we hold complexity in our minds now. Like thinking back, to even before 2020, I just don't know if we could have lived in a world we were still living in a world with many sort of opposing viewpoints, but we just weren't ever really willing to accept that. And the thing that I remember about that period was real extreme polarization. And I know that we've said that changed a bit with, a new US president coming in 2020, and that sort of changed the course of things. And we had longer time spans. But is polarization, do you think that's still an issue we need to be conscious of today, or have we done enough?
Honestly, I feel as though there's always going to be, and the research has shown that there's always going to be a small proportion at either end of a particular spectrum that will not budge. They will not change their mind. Polarisation is where they're happy to sit. And as we've seen over the last 9 years, you can waste your life trying to bring those people sort of back into the grey, I guess, or the beautiful complexity, the openness. Yeah, that's the word. Grey is not really the colour. The rainbow, I guess.
I love that openness is now synonymous with grey.
The openness. But it was good to see over the last 9 years that we didn't let those mentalities dominate what we were going to do. We didn't let those loud edges make all of the decisions. We thought, okay, that's what you think, that's fine, but we've got a job to do and we need to get on with it. And we did.
Yeah, there'll always be disagreement. I mean, look at now, you've got the huge public debate around, between the retreaters and the remainers. Like, do we spend all our money protecting, coastal, cities and things like that, or do we do a managed retreat and actually move our populations and make those hard decisions? Like that's, but there's, it's great to have 2 points of view and let those ideas battle it out. It was really when social media got regulated in 2023, when there was that big crackdown on Facebook, and the sources of a lot of kind of misinformation that drove a lot of the polarisation. I think that was one of the things that helped us kind of tone it down and get it, off that really extreme plateau where polarisation had been at the beginning of the decade.
And the demise of the Murdoch control on media and
Yes.
diversification of media sources as well, which allowed different voices and a more nuanced discussion on things. Yeah, you're right. We're more able to handle uncertainty a little bit too now, I think, and reasoned debate rather than sort of going for false certainties.
Yeah, and I've loved that that's happened outside of the formal school context as well. You still go to universities and you still get your high school diploma and get degrees to specialise, but I think by having those conversations in our communities, at those backyard barbecues, we made it okay to ask questions. We made it okay to be, potentially wrong with something that you think, and like changing your mind is okay. Like we cancelled culture from 2020, and we got into that point of evolution. Given that, you still work in academia, Michael, do you think that higher education changed? I always find higher ed can be a bit of a slow-moving beast.
I think main change, and as Eitan has mentioned, the kind of delivery of Indigenous content in schools, there was a really big push to get some serious curriculum and start educating our educators, if you like. That was a big shift. And I think just the flavour of debate changed, I think. I think we've just got better at having a debate and being able to walk away not having lost the debate, but sort of being comfortable with not having won or not having to be right all the time.
It's okay to just talk.
Just to talk, yeah. And I think we lost that for a long time. We lost the art of debate and the art of disagreement. Disagreement's natural. You're going to have polar views. You're going to have people. I think we lost the ability to have that in society, and higher education's led the way. Obviously, I think by greater contribution of academics and a greater respect that's come along from the community of experts. And I think we've engaged more in the higher education sector?
I reckon that also comes down to an increased personalisation. You know, facts are one thing, but stories are what people connect to. Humans are what people connect to. And we saw in 2020 in that lockdown where all of a sudden we were in people's homes, we saw people's cattails, we saw people's kids. And it was good to see that that never really got lost, that we still did get to know, okay, you're an expert, but you're also a dad and you're also a, you know, exactly. And I think that really...
humanising everything.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's funny that we were able to humanise people behind computer screens, you know, where everyone was two-dimensional.
A non-tangible way,
Yeah, and like who would have thought that was going to happen? You know, living in 2020 and like still really vividly remembering it.
Well, I remember in 2019, remember there was that viral video of that guy doing the TV interview on BBC. I think and his kid came into the room and that was just such a crazy thing. It went, you know, had millions of views. And 2020, we were all that guy.
Like, we were all that guy.
Now there's all those TV shows about it, you know, meet our kids, that's true.
That's so true. What, I guess, in the 9 years that have happened since a, you know, pretty rough and wild 2020 that has led to some good things and led to some things that we still need to work on, what advice would you give to 2020 you or like a community that you were working with in 2020? What would you tell them, knowing what we now do, about how the world currently is?
Well, you know, as you said in the intro, I was involved in the Million Jobs Plan in 2020, and really that was about saying there's a trend in place, a trend towards decarbonisation, and if we back that trend and if anything accelerate it, that will be great for the economy and we'll be able to bring forward jobs in the future to today. So my advice actually probably wouldn't be that different. I mean, all the clues were there in 2020 around where the trends were going. We knew what we had to do. We really did know what we had to do, and there was just vested interests that were trying to push us back. So it's kind of almost like you know, for everything we said about experts, it's almost like a trust your gut kind of thing. You know, we know where we're going and just keep going that direction, push harder. Australia's going to be fine. In fact, Australia's going to be great with the opportunities that brings up. So, yeah.
Keep going. I mean, I think it's just, as you were saying before, that pathway that no one ever would have predicted from lots of different events and just trusting your gut and going forward with it. What about you, Lyndon or Michael?
I think my advice would also be around opportunity. So in my work, obviously I do work with climate scientists and I do climate research, but I also work with science students, helping them tell the best story they can about their research so their work can make a difference. And we did this in 2020 and I really am glad we did, but I think possibly we could have hammered it home a bit more to the students that we should take this opportunity, take this appetite that exists in the community for science and this renewed passion for the discussion around science and the embracing of uncertainty or embracing of the reality of what science is, to really use this chance, this reset, to make some change, to share your work with whoever will listen to you, to talk with whoever about what they want to know. You know, have a lot of two-way conversations and really take this opportunity within your science, whatever it is, but particularly if it's climate science, to start making that change. And we did see that, we are continuing to see that, and it's great to see more scientists are communicating and are sharing their work and are talking with each other and with, you know, anybody and everybody. But that is a scary thing to do. So I think my advice to 2020 people would be to embrace this opportunity and make the most of it, because it really is something that we will never experience again. We lived through something really hard in 2020, and if we did that, as we've seen, we can do it again.
We can do anything as well, right? That's how I felt after 2020. I was like, yes, we can tackle this climate crisis because we did it with COVID. What about you, Michael?
Yeah, I'd tell myself to go harder, really. Like, I mean, I've been working really hard to get the stories of Aboriginal people and traditional owners out into the public and the role that we have in maintaining and managing this country. I think at that time there was a receptiveness to it, but still it needed to be argued for and constantly put into the arena. And I think given how far we've come on the road to self-determination and recognising Aboriginal people for their knowledge and what they have to offer, I just want to go back and go even harder and make it even further along the line. You know, that would be what I've been telling myself.
I love that your ambition hasn't changed in that decade. You know, people say with age you slow down a bit, but you're like, no, if I could do it again, I'd do it more. That's great.
I worry that all of our advice is also go more, go harder. Maybe
while slowing down. Because we somehow managed to do that, and it feels like one of those really weird cultural changes where, you know, you look back at, I wasn't alive then, but you look back at haircuts of like the 70s and 80s, I'm like, oh, when did people ever think that was like good and in fashion? Sorry to all people that I've just cast judgment on there. I was
Exactly,
like,
haircuts are cyclical.
because it is back in again. And I was like, I did also have a mullet last year. But it was just one of those things that happens so gradually, and we're now at that point where all of the things can exist at once, and we haven't quite figured out that like harmonious sort of relationship. But I think we've just like opened up the possibility that it is okay to not always be right or to like be wrong. It's not black and white. There is that grey is such a beautiful colour now. I think that's what I've come round to. Eitan, Michael, Lyndon, thank you so much for sharing with us your reflections over this last decade. I'm sure our audience will really echo my appreciation in your willingness to step into 2029 with such gusto, because hopefully as our listeners and at home will realise, we are still in 2020, which is to say that 2020 is still really hard, and everything that we just talked about, like that climate anxiety, I can still feel that on my shoulders. But listening to you both talk about how in 2029 we don't feel that guilt anymore, it's like, I felt that for the briefest of moments. So I'm really into this future that we've built together. So thank you so much for just sharing what is possible. And I think all of that advice that you gave to 2020 people, i.e. all of us here right now, makes a lot of sense. And it's not too late, Michael, to go harder. Like you still can. Yeah. The future is there. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did, learning and hearing a little bit about what this possible future could be. My main takeaway from this possible shared future that we just created for you today is that it really could be possible. And even if not this exactly, everything that we talked about was based on some combination of science or facts. So whether that was the science and technological solutions we have at hand, the policy mechanisms that we could be advocating for with governments, the communities that we talked about who are ready to lead the charge, they're already doing that. So maybe there's a local group that you could be joining in on. And of course, there's a wealth of First Nations knowledge that has always been there on these lands that we could be doing a much better job of, to stop for a moment, to pause, to listen and to learn something. The University of Melbourne is committed to being that bridge between research and action for us to achieve a net zero emissions future. The Climate Conversation series is just one initiative that the University of Melbourne currently has around climate change. If you wanted to learn more, you're welcome to visit our website. The URL is on the screen right now. And there's a bunch of resources that you'll be able to find on the website. Everything from past event recordings to research that we've done as an institute, and it's all there available for you to share to different friends, family, colleagues, to start up a bit of a conversation about climate change and what our future could look like. 2020 really has been quite a difficult year, and it was a lot of fun to think about what we learned from this moment in time, because the thing that I took away is, even though we spent lots of time at home this year, there's so much possibility in our future. I hope everyone has a really great holiday break where you get a little bit of rest and get ready to roll into 2021, where maybe it will be the turning point in how we respond to climate change as a country.